So welcome to the session, A Practical Guide to an Equitably Managed Decline in Fossil Fuel Extraction. I like that title very much because I think most people assume that there's no relationship between equity and practicality. But one of the contentions of this session is that there is actually a relationship between them, and that in fact, getting a workable solution to a massive commons problem like climate change may require, like it or not, some equity. So we'll be looking at some different dimensions of the equity issues that arise with a fossil fuel decline. Most of the climate equity scholarship done so far has been on equity and emissions declines, but a very different set of issues come up when talking about production declines. And so that's what we'll be focusing on. We'll start with Camila Bustos, a JD candidate at Yale Law School, and her work is focused on climate policy, human rights, and litigation in the US and also Colombia. So, Camila.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? So thanks again for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's my first time. So I'll talk a little bit about Colombia, and I'll just briefly talk about a background. I think most of you were, or maybe half of you were in the session this morning, earlier today, so you'll have some of that. And then I'll try to focus on the challenges and then some of the opportunities. So I'll try to build on Claudia's presentation from this morning. So as some of you may know, Colombia is now considered a middle-income economy. Its greenhouse gas emissions have increased significantly since the 2000s, but this have been mostly driven by land changes, essentially deforestation and some industrialization. In terms of our energy matrix, it is relatively clean. It is mostly hydro. But the issue at stake here is that our second export product is coal after oil, which is our first one. And it is mostly located in the Caribbean coast, so in two departments, Cesar and Guajira. There is production of coal elsewhere in the country, but this is where most of it is coming from. And it puts us in the position where we are the fourth largest thermal coal exporter in the world, precisely because it is high quality coal and it is relatively cheap. The companies in the country are still benefiting from subsidies, tax exemptions, rebates, and there is little oversight after the licenses are granted. Just recently, like I think it was a month ago, the General Controller Office, or Contraloría, couldn't assert what were the environmental and health impacts of the coal industry, even though it's been there for more than 2 decades. So currently, most of those exports are going to Turkey, Northwest Europe, Mexico, Spain, some to Chile, and Portugal. But as SCI and Carbon Tracker and others have shown, there's an expected decline in the demand. And so we're trying to think, what does this mean for Colombia? Precisely because Europe and the Americas, especially US, were our main importers of coal, but consumption is changing there. So can I get the clicker, please? Thank you. So that's me. So that's a map. So currently, we don't have a lot of coal power plants. As I said, more than 90% of it is exported. But now there's plans to have one in Cesar region called La Luna. And that is quite concerning, given that we don't have that trend. But if we see investments, there could be a significant lock-in. So the problem with coal is that it plays such an important role in the economy in terms of the royalties it brings, and because it is a second export product, 1.3% of our GDP comes from coal. And as Claudia was talking about narratives this morning, the traditional, and she's just here, this development model has really relied on fossil fuel extraction, especially since the 2000s, and the discussions about growth and development have been totally co-opted. So when you think about what prosperity means for the Colombian context, it's been co-opted by these industries. And again, coal represents more than 40% of the GDP for these two departments, which obviously brings challenges as to what the transition will look like, and about 18% of total royalties in the country. So one of the main challenges is that, as Claudia said, no one's really talking about this. It's very short-sighted. There was a recent fiscal document that a colleague pointed to me yesterday that spends a few pages talking about sort of what the decline in international demand will mean for Colombia, and that's based on some of our colleagues' work, Roman and Pauyu. But it really is just a very superficial analysis of what this means. There's really no plans. And when you look at the documents from the mining ministry and the energy planning unit, there's really nothing. There's no discussion about transition. However, we know the mining companies will leave. So there are three major ones. Cerrejón, which is the picture before this, largest open pit in Latin America, will close by 2034, Prodeco by 2030, and Drummond by 2035. And they've told us this, right? So in 2017, there was a very important mining forum in which they said to the government, we are leaving. So it's not like we don't know this is happening. The question is, why aren't we moving? And part of that is because, again, as I said, there's a lot of inertia in the system, there's a lack of planning, and there's also very little trust in state institutions. We're talking about two departments of Colombia that also have the lowest socioeconomic indicators. So these folks don't trust the state. Their basic needs are not met. They suffer from water scarcity, you name it. And at the same time, and in contrast to everything, as it was mentioned, Colombia is exiting this more than 50-year-long war. We signed a peace deal in 2016, but what that means now is that violence has peaked. So a lot of environmental defenders, community leaders, activists, advocates are being killed and threatened. So what does that mean? What does a just transition look like in a context where the people who are fighting for a transition or who may be thinking about transition don't feel safe, which is a point that Andrea emphasized on this morning. There's also very limited information on the alternatives. So right now there are 30,000 people who have direct positions and about 100,000 that are indirect jobs. And the question is, what are they going to be doing? And the responses will vary for large-scale mining versus a small-scale mining. But again, one of the difficulties is that because of the very structural inequalities that this region faces, and specific things like lack of infrastructure and unequal access to land and land conflict, how are we thinking about a transition in a place that already has this very troubled context? People have mentioned tourism, agriculture, but again, there are challenges with those, and we can talk maybe later about it. And there's also the expectation of higher salaries. So folks that work in mines are used to a certain lifestyle, and it'll be very hard to convince them to leave the mines unless you provide at least equal conditions. So to the opportunities. There is a big opportunity for the government to get involved here, and I think it's what folks have been discussing. How do we engage the policymakers and the decision makers in this? And when I say this, I mean folks in the planning department, in the Ministry of Mines, and at the local level, of course, to work with the people at the mines and those affected by the mines, and thinking a lot about a long-term strategy that is compatible with a just transition. But if those conversations don't happen in the first place, there will be no buy-in and there will be no sustainability of the process. So it's very important, which I think is sort of what the work that Andrea and other NGOs are leading in terms of like having these local conversations. But if the government doesn't support that or doesn't leverage what's already happening, it's unlikely that this will turn into something more concrete. We also need more examples, thank you, from Global South countries. So as it's been said, most of the things in front of us are transitions in the UK, in Germany, and other places that have very different economies than the one that Colombia has. And then there is the opportunity with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. And there's been two conversations that are parallel and have not really connected to each other. So there's the folks that have been negotiating the SDGs for Colombia and our NDC, and then the more local development discussions. And those seem to be pointing at very different directions because Colombia plays a very ambitious role in international negotiations and has a really great team. And internally, you know, as I've said, things look very different. So trying to take advantage of those two fora and try to connect them. At the same time, there is this whole recent wave of popular consultations that are really shaking the paradigm. So essentially what's happening is that local towns and municipalities have voted through a constitutional mechanism called popular consultations to say no to mining and other extractive industries. And so obviously this has forced a debate on development, which I think is very interesting because it's starting to position this idea of, okay, if we're not using coal, if we're not using gold, what are we using and how are we sustaining our economies? And I don't think there are clear answers to that yet, but I think it is fostering a discussion that hasn't happened before. And I think there's room for opportunity there. However, there are problems with some of those consultations, mostly because companies, foreign-owned companies, and the national government are not very happy about what's going on. So what is happening in the background of that is that they're having closed-door meetings with some of the mayors to sort of come to a consensus about what the mining areas should be. But it's not really open, it's not transparent, and there's no real participation. In many of the situations, the mayors are called into these meetings, they are shown some documents showing the potential of mining in the region, they're forced to sign something, and there we go. And then who knows what happened and if that area is going to be explored or not. So I'm just gonna conclude with 3 points that are sort of my take-home messages. The first one is that I think there needs to be a strategy that is both government-led, but also that incorporates like the grassroots work that's happening. I don't think if you just do the grassroots work, it'll work, or if you just have like a bunch of high officials from the mining industry and the planning department working together, that will result in something that's sustainable long-term. I think it needs to be coming from the bottom up and from the top down as well. Second, we need to figure out how to finance this. Most transitions around the world, if not all, have had some sustainable source of funding, which I see as a main barrier to this, because a lot of the climate finance Colombia is receiving is geared towards deforestation, which, don't get me wrong, is really important. The Amazon is a huge problem. But when we're thinking about how to support a process like this, if we don't have a predictable source of funding, I really don't know how this would happen. So I think we have to start thinking about how to gear climate finance into this conversation. And the third one is thinking about narratives. So again, the narratives around development and environment and growth have been co-opted by these industries. And so how do we change that? How do we use our own narratives to push back? And one of the things I think we haven't really tapped into, although I think Baoyu's and Roman's work is getting to this, is sort of the economic argument, which is essentially going to convince folks in the room that are not going to listen to climate advocates, right? So thinking about our audience and what is the strategic message to send home, which is something that Fernanda was talking earlier today, which I think it's true. So in the human rights community, for example, we've used a lot of naming and shaming. So what other tools can we use in addition to this to really sort of foster a conversation? And I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you, Camila. Thank you very much. You've queued up some really important questions that thankfully we'll be picking up and treating a little bit more. Steve will talk about one of the issues that's implicit and very important in Camila's presentation. There's a lot of inertia within the state and within the government to support the continued exploitation of fossil fuels. And that has a lot to do with the benefits to be gained from fossil fuels in terms of foreign exchange revenue. So Steve will be talking about how can the allocation of extraction across different countries affect those revenues, and how might that be addressed in an equitable way. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. Great to be here. Thank you for having me. The title of this is Climate Constrained Fossil Fuel Production Under Equity Considerations. It's work that myself and Sean Bradley from Chatham House have been thinking about and taking forward as part of the report that was presented in the morning panel this morning. So just to move on, I mean, the context of the study is that DFID, the funders of the work, were obviously very interested in the McGlade and Eakins paper that looked at unburnable fossil fuels, although it was on a sort of economically efficient basis, so what was optimal in terms of which countries got to produce and which had to leave their reserves in the ground. And there was some interest, given the debate that was happening, about looking at what would happen actually if we disrupted that model. We looked at introducing an equity, some sort of equity criteria into that picture. And so that's what we did. We have a model, so we used it. You can tell me at the end whether you think models should be part of this or not. But that's where we were coming from. So it was very much, there's a growing literature on the subject, but maybe some less quantitative analysis. So that's what we brought to this. So this is very much an illustrative modelling analysis. So don't get too hung up on the numbers, but hopefully provide some insights into the discussion that we're having. Just to mention that the analysis is featured in this report that was presented this morning, but it's in box 9. So it was going to be quite a thread through the report, but it got boxed. So I don't know what that says about how funders view this whole issue and how they can deal with it. But I thought that was quite interesting. So the approach was to introduce a differentiated carbon tax on fossil fuel production in a transition to a 2-degree world. So basically a tax on production was implemented across regions according to their development need, based on the Human Development Index, which was one of the approaches in the Kenya report that was produced for Oxfam. So what we did was we used a global energy model, which was run to comply with a 2 C warming limit to explore the change in production under high and low tax cases, and compare that against the cost optimal or economically efficient case. So within a 2-degree world, we have a similar level of fossil fuels that are being produced, but we're geographically redistributing them based on this carbon tax mechanism. And just say the carbon tax was really used as a way of doing this redistribution. It wasn't a proposal to use this as a global tax in terms of a policy approach. So that's just to be clear on that. And the focus was on oil and gas as the key areas of interest for the report as well. So just to say how we did this, so we have 3 groups in different HDI categories, so low, medium, high, and very high. We have an issue of aggregation, disaggregation in terms of spatial scale, so we lumped certain regions in the model together into these 3 different groupings. So we're focusing really on HDI group 1, which was Africa, India, and other developing Asia. And then you can see, sorry. I didn't move the slide on. Okay, so we have three groupings. Okay, so that you can get an idea of the regional groups there, and then the production tax level on the right-hand side. So in the low tax case, we're applying a tax in 2050 rising from a lower level of 20, 140, 230 to the 3 different groups, and then in the high tax level, 60, 350, and 600 in 2050. So these are graduated from a lower tax rate in our base year 2015. And don't worry too much about the size of the tax levels, Frank. These are this is really just to give a range and to see how the model responds. Okay, so onto some results. So just to explain the 2 graphs. So on the left-hand side we have the high tax case. On the right-hand side the low tax case, and the different regional changes in terms of the share of global production in a tax case versus a cost optimal case. So the greys and the reds are the HDI group 1. And the blues are the HDI2 group, which is the high development group, which includes Russia and the Middle East and China. And then the greens or oranges, as it appears on the slide, are the high development countries. And I suppose there's two key insights here that I would take from this, that actually overcoming economic efficiency is pretty challenging. We only actually see, even under very high carbon taxes on production, a shift at around 2045 in terms of a move, a redistribution of the production share towards the lower developed regions. So there's obviously this tension in terms of economic efficiency versus equity, and also the fact that you need a very high production tax to actually make any sizable shift. And you can see on the right-hand side that the shift in allocation is about 10%. Across the time horizon. The other thing to say is that up to 2045 on the left-hand side, actually we see the global picture is of a declining oil market, of course. So actually the low-medium development group is actually declining in production, and it's only this redistribution through the tax that actually pushes their actual production up again, but only after 2045. So there's a question of whether there's any near-term gain in terms of introducing this kind of equity criteria. Okay, I wanted to say a couple of things on costs as well. So that's the next slide. Just a quick sort of description of what the graphs are. So on the left-hand side, we have the change in energy system cost in terms of the high case and the low tax case, and the fact that the positive bar is a lot bigger than the negative bar suggests that there's a net increase in overall costs, which is what we'd expect if we're moving towards higher cost resources. But the point, three, great. So that could be expected, and on the right hand side we see the shift in terms of the commodity trade costs. So the pink bar or the red bar is China, and the bars below the line are the HDI1 groups. So here we can see that actually a country like China is paying a lot more overall in terms of commodity trade costs, and there's some benefit, of course, to the HDI1 group. Now, I suppose the issue here is what is the equity perspective here? It would seem to me that this is that what we're doing is very much focusing on production-based equity, but actually for consumers that are more import dependent, there's an issue there. And also the other thing to mention on the left-hand graph is that in terms of the increase in total costs in 2070, you can see a small green shaded area, which is actually Africa, which actually sees in the high tax case a increase in overall system costs. So in terms of the equity argument, there's something to be said about how far you push countries in terms of developing their resources, when in fact they might be able to import much more cost effectively rather than produce their own reserves. Okay, so this is going to be my last slide, the insights. So moving from an efficiency approach to one that's equity-based requires large disincentives. At least that's our thinking, both for oil and for gas. I haven't presented gas here, but we see a similar-ish picture. And redistribution type mechanisms do not assure sustainability of production over time due to the declining market overall in the global economy, notably for oil. So again, it's this issue that okay, we're bending the production curve back up for low medium developed countries, but actually they're only seeing this upward trend out in the 2040s. So why would you go down that path? And then while producers benefit, importers might be negatively impacted. So whose equity perspective are we looking at? And then two more points. Then there's a risk of pushing high-cost investment in extractives that may not benefit a country if indeed those fossil fuels can be imported at a lower cost. So it's about the equity agenda, not well, again, it's this trade-off between economic efficiency and equity. And then finally, well, one of the things from the modeling is that we don't see any impact in terms of the domestic energy system. So pushing towards a redistribution doesn't see fossil use increase domestically, which is quite interesting. So under a 2-degree world, countries are still very much pushing on a low carbon pathway. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Steve. Steve has noted a few important things about what happens if you try and shuffle around a right to extract to account for equity considerations. You get a fairly delayed response, and you get some perverse implications as far as system cost, notably to Africa. And so Alex is going to talk about an alternative to actually shifting around a right to extract. He's going to talk about compensation. Alex is a Fulbright scholar and PhD candidate in philosophy at University of Washington, and his research and advocacy as well is focused on climate justice and an equitable and rapid end to the fossil fuel era. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Sivan. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me all right there? Yeah, sounding good. So thanks for having me. The sort of motivating question behind this research, seeing as I'm based in that's gone too far, in a philosophy department, is very much a moral question, and the moral questions do inform the legal questions, but it's a different sense of justice in some ways, thinking about what the moral questions outlie, even though they do inform the legal questions. And the sort of question that I'm looking at is this idea of when we owe compensation to those that are negatively impacted by the stranding of fossil fuels, right? And what is it that we owe them? So to sort of get a sense of the context of this, I think we're fortunate to follow Steve in this regard, but looking at when we do model a pathway that focuses mostly on efficiency, we see that those that are most negatively impacted is the countries or the regions that one would hope would not be impacted on an equity lens. And so this is modeling that Sivan and his team put forward. And as we see, a merely efficient pathway to stranded assets, you see a lot of the future foregone rents, and this is relative to total projected income. The negative impacts are more profound in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America than in the wealthier countries of North America and Europe, right? And this, in a way, is very different to what we'd expect if we're looking at what is an equitable allocation, right? So this is a relatively new area in the literature, trying to define what an equitable allocation of, a supply of the remaining fossil fuel budget for extraction looks like. But we had, in 2016, the report that came from Simon Caney, which was the Oxfam report, and there they defined it as giving priority in the production of fossil fuel to those who have a lower standard of living, who have least extracted and benefit from past fossil fuel extraction, and have the least alternative means of meeting developmental needs. And we saw a similar sort of lens come through in the Lofoten Declaration, which was the civil society declaration about a managed decline for fossil fuel production, and signed on by, I forget how many hundred civil society organizations at this point, but pretty broad support. And so at this sort of broad level of what an equitable allocation looks like, you have this agreement about how we give priority. I think when we go for more fine detail, there will be different theories of justice that might tweak how we see which different countries would get priority, and we have within our ranks Berit Christofferson, who's done some of that work and is worth looking at. But at this broader level, you have this sort of consensus, and I think in a way it maps onto the Demandside consensus about that you see within the UNFCCC about common and about differentiated responsibilities. So then when we're thinking about how do we deal with the areas of convergence and divergence between equity and economic efficiency, in the 2018 paper that I wrote on this, as part of the advice was to think about where are the areas of convergence between equity and economic efficiency. And there, of course, you focus on things like Canadian tar sands and Australian coal, or as we're seeing now, California's oil production, areas where it's economically inefficient and where it is also equitably important, because these are rich developed nations who should be leaving fossil fuels in the ground under these equity lenses. And then, of course, there's the third element to that, which is the procedural justice question too, which is following the leadership of frontline communities, which was central to the Lofoten Declaration, certainly. And there, of course, places like the Canadian tar sands are an important example where you have First Nations leadership also pushing back against fossil fuel extraction. So those are the areas where you have the convergence of equity and economic efficiency, and they seem like smart strategic areas for climate justice advocates to focus on, given that. But the question comes up when there's a divergence between economic efficiency, how do we do it? And one way is to think about ideas of compensation. but there's a difficult moral question as to when compensation is due. And so I think useful to turn to is this idea of a theory of legitimate expectations, or what we can legitimately expect in the face of a transition. Fortunately, there's good literature on this. Fergus Green has done good work in compiling this. And he says that when we're looking at sort of what we can legitimately expect or claim within a transition, you need to look at the specification of the kinds of agents that have moral standing, so who should be able to make those claims for transitional relief. You need a conception of the relevant transitional effects, and you need a specification of the available responses, and then a set of principles that determine when a recognized agent who has been affected can actually have a moral claim. And I think it's a nice framework to look at and to potentially employ in this area of compensation for stranded fossil fuel assets. So as we sort of bring it into the space of stranded fossil fuel assets, I think there's a few difficult moral issues that begin to surface. And one of the major ones is this question of causality, because when we think about stranded fossil fuel assets, can we only make a moral claim to compensation when those assets are stranded specifically as a result of climate policy? Or is it, if it's by market mechanisms, because a lot of the stranding that we're going to be seeing is going to be as a result of declines in technology, going to be a result of market-based movements, not specifically climate regulation. And so there's this question of when can we make the moral claim, and is it only based on climate regulation? The second one is thinking about compensation against different moral baselines, right? Are we saying that we should be compensated for as much fossil fuels as we would burn if we were going towards a 4°C world? And can we really justify that? And so the analogy that some philosophers have been using in this space is, should we be able to make a claim that, let's say you're selling mines for a living, right? And you try and make a claim saying that, well, we've got foregone revenue because we're stopping war, right? It doesn't seem that you're justified to make a claim on that particular moral baseline, because it seems like it's a problematic moral baseline. Similarly, it's not clear that we have a legitimate moral claim to say that we deserve the fossil fuels that may have been burnt under a 4°C world. And then the third sort of major difficult one is differentiating between the moral claims of different agents in this space. And I think looking at countries versus communities versus corporations, and then the really fuzzy gray area between that is national oil companies, I think will be really difficult. And then when we're thinking about claims of compensation, thinking about the benefits and harms from actually leaving fossil fuels in the ground, and whether the resource curse might make it such that some communities would be better off if they stranded fossil fuels. And of course, there's controversy here, which I think myself as a philosopher will not try to resolve in this space. But when you look at some of the oil and gas bans happening in Latin America, for instance, the reasons for doing that are not necessarily climate-related reasons. It's biological diversity. And so it's interesting to think about the benefits that come from leaving that in the ground and what that means for compensation claims. So moving from the sort of abstract thinking of problems, looking at sort of like a crude claim of compensation, you have this idea that a resource-rich country or company should be compensated whenever their fossil fuel assets are stranded, and those in this position have supposedly foregone an opportunity that otherwise would have been available to them, right? And so the first problem that comes in is foregone according to what baseline, as we've already discussed. But then the related objection is that it's not enough that one loses an opportunity, but one needs some sort of moral claim or entitlement that such an opportunity may have afforded, right? So what is the moral claim that you're making on that front? And looking into the literature, what we've seen so far is the moral grounds for compensation come from typically the right to develop. So Simon Kameny and Chris Armstrong, two philosophers who worked on this space, say that when we're thinking about who has moral claims to compensation, it should be those that have the right to develop. And the other is it's coming from Sivan, Kartha, and Greg Matter, who've got this draft paper coming out, which is thinking that compensation for foregone revenue is probably the wrong way to look at this, and that actually what we're looking at is how can we offset the cost of the transition, right? How can we support countries to make sure that their curbing of extraction doesn't compromise their urgent developmental needs? So it's very much a focus on developmental needs. And I think, moving towards transitional costs is an important element, but there is a question of distributional justice, where as developed countries continue to extract fossil fuels and make it such that developing countries have to leave more and more in the ground, that maybe just the transitional costs are not enough to address the questions of equity that come, and that there might be further needs in terms of meeting those distributional justice questions. So moving on, just to keep with time, I think one of the worries that we face in this area is the sort of usurping of these claims of compensation by fossil fuel corporations. So that we have sort of legitimate claims of moral compensation that may be made by developing countries, but what we see now are those that are most successful at making claims for compensations are indeed corporations, whether that's through investor-state dispute settlements, right? Or as we're starting to see here in the US, you have the Colorado Amendment 74, which is the Takings Initiative. And that's basically what they're trying to do, is shift the law so that companies, it used to be the case that you could get compensation if the government took away all your property pretty much. Now they're trying to make it the case that if the fair market value of your assets gets declined or reduced by government intervention, then you can claim compensation for that, right? And so you see that fossil fuel companies are trying to take this approach to compensation and take hold of it. And the objections to that is that, of course, the right to development doesn't apply. And then there's this question that there is no legitimate expectation to continue a business model that does harm, right? And so central to most constitutions is this idea of no harm principle. And so it seems problematic that fossil fuel companies, at least morally speaking, should be doing this. But they are moving to put in place many laws that allow them to do this. And then the other element of this speaks to the Exxon News sort of revelations, where it's not the case that the interventions that are going on to decline the value of fossil fuel companies were unexpected regulations. They've known about this for a very long time. And when it comes to legitimate expectations about getting compensation for undue government intervention, part of it is that there are immediate interventions that were unforeseen. But in this case, these are clearly foreseen regulations that fossil fuel companies have known about, have been lobbying against for a long time. So I think there's a good moral case against the sorts of claims that corporations are making and that are trying to enshrine in the law. But if we don't move very quickly to prevent that, it seems like these will be the companies that will be getting most of the compensation. And in the terms of thinking about that in the broader context of climate finance, where we see developing countries getting very little climate finance, Green Climate Fund is pretty much running dry, it would seem like a pretty deep injustice that corporations would be the ones taking compensation. I don't think it takes a philosopher to know that, though. But I guess we face an interesting dilemma in some regards when it comes to compensating for stranded fossil fuel reserves. So I think looking historically, we have, this is a tweet from the, oh wait, I pressed the wrong button. Oh, I haven't been pressing here, I've been pressing there. So you guys haven't seen any of that, have you?
We'll download it.
Okay, well, there's a lot of good slides in there if you want to look at them. Oh, man. Okay, here I am looking at this stuff. So anyway, this is a good one. So the abolitionist dilemma that we so when we look to the UK Treasury, this is a tweet from them this year, looking at the historic example of ending slavery in Britain, where there was a significant payment of about 40% of the British income at the time to end slavery. In some ways, you see this. And it's deeply inequitable. It was a big transfer of wealth from the British taxpayers to those who'd benefited from slaveholding already, right? And so that seems deeply inequitable at the time, right? And that there's no right to hold slaves, and there shouldn't have been a right to hold slaves, right? They really shouldn't have been compensated for that. But looking at that historically, there's this pride from the Treasury that, they were the ones who paid for this, right? And I guess there's an interesting question similarly when it comes to the stranding of fossil fuel reserves, whether we say, well, it's unequitable to compensate corporations, but maybe it's worth doing politically because that will mean that we can more smoothly navigate the political difficulties of this transition. Yeah. But it seems like the inequities of that would be pretty gross and would result in the transferring of significant wealth to corporations. So I think the difficult question is how do we navigate these issues of compensation and ensure that fossil fuel companies aren't usurping them. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Excellent. That's very helpful because compensation has been historically a very dominant frame in the discussion around supply-side inequity, going back to something that Joanna de Pledge referred to in a session yesterday she was moderating, that Saudi Arabia won very few friends over to the idea of looking sympathetically upon the plight of the producer when it used that as the foundation for a whole strategy of obstruction. But there are legitimate claims, and it's helpful that Alex has helped parse them between claims that may not have any moral standing and others that may. We're going to move on to Jeremy, who will present a range of ways in which supply-side policies can help us deal with the range of moral issues that arise and ethical issues that arise. Jeremy is a professor of philosophy at University of New South Wales, and he directs the Practical Justice Initiative and the Climate Justice Research Program. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So look, for me, one of the most interesting thing about this conference is that we've heard a huge number, an impressive number of reasons why we should prefer supply-side measures. And I think in total, those reasons add up to a very compelling case for why we should be interested and indeed push to implement supply-side measures. But I think what we also need to reflect on is the sense in which those supply-side measures can be just measures. So not just that they'll be effective, not just that they'll be efficient, but that they also can achieve and can tick off against substantive justice or moral goals. And I want to take a wide lens view about how supply-side measures might be able to achieve some of those things, indeed if they can. And I want to focus on social justice because, as we know, with any kind of measure that we introduce in response to climate change, it's going to have a huge impact on people. It might have a negative impact, indeed it might have a positive impact, and we need to be able to get that right in order to say that we've responded in the right way. So we need to be concerned about social justice measures for these negative type reasons. But we also, hopefully, need to be concerned about them because they offer the possibility of us making society, and indeed global society, more equal, for instance, in important ways. Now, that might seem like a very ambitious goal when we can't even get enough action on climate change to have a reasonable chance of preventing it. But I don't see why we shouldn't include that in our thinking. So for these two reasons, I think when we talk about any kind of response to climate change, whether it's supply side or not, we need to be able to ask ourselves and answer whether or not it has an integrated approach and a substantive approach to social justice questions. And I think supply side measures are able to do that for three primary reasons. And that is because I think they're just responses because firstly, they target the right agents. Secondly, they deal with the problem of moral free riding that comes with being an export country. And thirdly, they have the possibility of delivering what I call an egalitarian dividend. Now, I just want to talk about the first two today because of reasons of time. So I think targeting the right kind of agents, okay, that's one of the reasons why I think we should be in favour of supply-side measures. Not, I hasten to add, to the exclusion of all other measures, but this is just one reason in favour of them. So on the whole, I think when we come to think about how we distribute the benefits and burdens of responding to climate change, one of the principles that ought to guide our thinking in this case is what I'm calling a fault-based principle. So that is the principle that, on the whole, agents who've contributed to a problem ought to be liable for some, or indeed all, of some of the costs of fixing that problem. So I think this kind of fault-based principle is intuitively plausible. It's not the only principle, but it's one that I think that we ought to take seriously when we're considering the advantages or otherwise of supply-based responses to climate change. And why do they get a tick according to this principle? Well, because supply-side measures target the producers of fossil fuels who, as we've heard, I think, time and time again, at this event and at many others, bear a significant degree of responsibility for the harms and the threat of harms of climate change. Now, I'm not suggesting producers bear all that responsibility, but I think for two reasons they bear a significant responsibility, and that is because of their role in the causal chain in actually supplying fossil fuels, but more importantly, because of a category of what I call influence, so the way in which they can influence the actions of others, principally governments and other agencies, to make climate-friendly policies. And this combination of reasons, this nexus of reasons, I think makes them particularly responsible. And so it's important that the policies that we adopt do target the right kind of agents who are responsible. A reason that I won't really elaborate on today is also an expressive reason. So we're concerned with distributive reasons when we're concerned about distributing the various costs and the various benefits of responding. But it's also important that our principles of justice express something that we think is significant. So in Australia, we commonly have water restrictions during summer, or at least we used to. And if I go and hose down my driveway or hose my car, I'm not going to drain the dam, okay? But I'm violating an expressive instance of justice there. People, my neighbours, care because I'm not doing my share. I'm not showing enough respect for the principles and sacrifices that everyone else is making. And I think having supply side measures as part of our response is also good in that sense. But I also think the second major reason why we should give supply side measures a tick is because of what I call exported emissions. So as you all know, how we count emissions and who's responsible for them follows a territorial model. So scope 1 and 2 emissions are the emissions that are produced within a country's territorial boundaries. Scope 3 emissions are the emissions produced, say, when another country burns, say, Australia's coal, for instance. Now, scope 3 emissions aren't attributed to the country who produced them, produced in the sense of produced the fossil fuel. But a moment's reflection, I claim, ought to show you this is not true. So, for instance, if one of you is feeling particularly murderous today and tells me, well, look, I want to kill someone, and I open my jacket and I say, well, look, I have this gun that I can sell you, and then you go and kill someone, well, I'm not a murderer, you're the murderer. But I'm an accomplice, okay? I must bear some of the moral responsibility for facilitating your action in that way. Not all the responsibility. And furthermore, if I've encouraged you to behave in that way, then I get extra responsibility. I'm a co-conspirator. And this surely must be the model, or at least arguably, well, in fact, I argue this is the model, that we should use to understand the responsibility of fossil fuel exporting nations. I think that they're morally responsible, at least for part of the emissions and then the harms that those emissions may or may not cause to other people. And so we should ask them to pay or accept some moral responsibility for the damage that they've done. And just as my contribution to facts and figures is very exciting for philosophers, this should be a huge issue for exporting nations. So we can see there some of the actual emissions that, say, Australia produces, and then the actual emissions down there in red when you add the emissions from coal and gas. So it's a very significant increase in the actual carbon budget of a country like Australia, which has huge implications for our transition and also for the liabilities that a country like Australia has to other countries. Now, in fact, the same is true, arguably worse, for Norway. There's some figures that we compiled. It is slightly disturbing to me, I must say, that in this conference, Australia and Norway have sort of emerged as the bad guys. I'm not sure why this is. We're such nice people, but I don't know what it is. Anyway, at any rate, one of the reasons that I think that supply-side measures are indeed a just response and should be given a seal of approval for that reason is because they correct, or they can correct, for the moral free riding that countries like Australia and Norway and other fossil fuel exporting nations currently have. So, of course, what can countries do? Obviously, if they are exporting nations, it's very hard for them to impose demand-side measures on other countries. And even if they could do that, it wouldn't necessarily, I think, be morally the best thing to do. Morally, the best thing to do, as I've said, is to target the right agents. And that's not necessarily the consumers in other countries. It's the producers, the primary causes of producing and consuming fossil fuels. So I think supply-side measures enable us to address this moral lacunae, if you like, that exists currently in the current way that countries are given moral responsibility for the production of emissions. So this ought not to be allowed to go on, and supply-side measures give us one reason, one very strong and compelling moral reason why we should adopt them, because they do address this problem of exports. So just to conclude then, I think, as I said, I'm not suggesting that supply-side measures are the only responses that we ought to have, and there's certainly not ones, and moral reasons are not the only reason we should prefer them. But this is my bias, of course, but I think if we can't articulate as part of our response to climate change whether it's just or not, then we're not doing a very good job, and that we're not also, we have reasons to pause before we proceed with any kind of policy, unless we can tick that box. And I think a moral analysis helps us to tick that box, especially in relation to supply-side measures. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was I would say, a very helpful survey of a number of the equity issues underlying the role of supply-side policies, and also the moral justification for using supply-side policies. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A, the floor. So I'm more than happy to entertain questions now. I see a question from Hannah, and then a question from further back, and then, so 1, 2, 3 in the way back, 4, 5, and then we'll pass it to the speakers.
My question is to Jeremy. I am Andrea Cardoso from the Universidad Magdalena from Colombia. Thank you, Jeremy, for your presentation. Actually, I always claim that Colombia has a lot of moral responsibility of the exporter call. So my question is how to include this data in the climate negotiation, because the Colombian government is so proud that our energy is based on hydropower and doesn't take into account the amount of coal that we are exporting in the climate negotiation or in the climate policy. So how to include that in the policy making process?
Thanks. Hannah from Oil Change International. This is just a question for the panel on perspectives, which is, do you identify tension between, let's say, intranational equity and international equity? If we look at intranational equity, for example, as a just transition, and does that prolong a transition in countries that can afford to do it at the peril of what we need more globally from an equity perspective? So just interested in some thoughts on that.
Jessica?
Yeah.
There's one in the far back, and then 2 on this
There we go.
side.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm the overflow behind the curtain. So a comment and then a question. So my comment, we use the analogy of compensating the slave trade a lot, where we compensate for a social bad. I think the better analogy is the reaction of the Chinese emperor to the opium addiction of his nation, which the Americans and the French and the Brits dominated, particularly the Brits, the export of opium to China. He declared war, that's what he did with the industry. And then when he lost, he declared war again, the second opium war, and got beaten again. But ultimately, the exporters learned to stop exporting what was essentially a really bad product. And I much prefer that analogy than to the compensation for the slave trade. So my question really is about the viability of the arguments, and I've loved this conversation exchange. I'm Mark from Carbon Tracker, and to think about it, I have a slight concern, and the concern I have is that if you transfer production rights to countries which economically they are, say they're producing oil at $75 a barrel cost of production, they sell at $80 a barrel cost of production, they make $5 a profit. Okay, but if you allow the carbon budget to be owned by a country that produced at $10 a barrel and sold at $80 a barrel, you produce $70 of economic utility, which is then reinvested back into society through a health and education or taxation, or is invested into global capital markets. And that utility argument essentially I feel is much stronger, because you can then transfer the profits to the Southern Hemisphere through, it becomes a compensation mechanism, where it also becomes the basis of potentially a new agreement. So I just want to put that to you. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, rather than being tied down into sort of transfer rights to the South and so on. Thanks.
Yeah, Richard from Climate Accountability Institute. I love all your presentations and your thinking. I appreciate that. One question for Mark is, can we distinguish in terms of stranded assets, in terms of developed and undeveloped reserves? And can we create a market by which I can buy a stranded barrel of oil and pay more for one that's stranded this year rather than stranded 10 years from now? And the second question, to Jeremy, you talked about agents and wondering at the transferability of the moral responsibility and the burden, of course, to the active agents, the producers in each country, BHP and Equinor, for example.
One more on this side.
Just a very quick comment only. We have the slave trade and the opium trade, but you don't even need to go that far. You just look at demand-side climate policy. I mean, the establishment of the ETS required the European Emissions Trading Scheme required a huge wealth transfer to polluting companies. So it was sort of a political bargain that in order to get this happening, the bad guys had to be compensated.
Okay. We could just go down the line and you can pick and choose and decide what you'd like to address. Start with you, Steve.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll take the question on the argument the issue of utility, and I mean, I think that's kind of where our analysis was sort of pushing towards in terms of applying equity criteria and coming out with a non-optimal solution where we're artificially pushing production to higher cost regions. So I absolutely take that. I still wonder if you're even if you make the additional revenue, you can transfer it in theory. I just wonder if you're still there still seems to be a practical question as to how any of that is actually mobilized in reality. In terms of transferring of wealth based on the additional money that's been made from more economic resources.
Okay, so look, a couple of questions. So look, on the first question that was asked of me about how we get this into the climate negotiations, I don't have a very good response to that in terms of a practical way of doing that, except to say that I think we have to abandon the idea of constraining responsibility by territorial boundaries. I just don't think that is in any way captures a plausible moral framework that we need to analyse who is responsible for the harms that are being caused. I don't necessarily think that, I used to think, and perhaps I still do, I'm not sure, that it should just be reflected in a country's carbon budget. I think that's a little bit complex, but I do think countries ought to accept moral responsibility for at least the harms that their exports are causing, even if that doesn't end up changing their carbon budgets. That would be my answer to that question. Look, just on the international, on the international equity, I do think we have to try and synthesize those questions, I suppose. And one very good example for that to me is that we often talk about using the proceeds of some sort of imposition on a domestic fossil fuel industry to help with domestic transitions. And to me, I mean, I can see why that's politically obvious, but it's not morally obvious to me at all that that's what we should do. In fact, I don't think countries like Australia and Norway should focus, at least morally speaking, on their own transitions because of the harm they've done to others, and because all the benefits of doing so accrue to their citizens. Now, I agree that's wildly implausible, but you know, morally speaking, I think that's probably where we ought to start from. Just very briefly on the moral, transferring moral responsibility to companies and corporations. Not sure I fully grasped that, but I suppose why I was focusing on countries is that perhaps I naively think that countries are the agents that we should look to here, or nations rather, the governments of nations, who have the authority to fix this. And it's partly because while I do think corporations are responsible in a very important sense, corporations are also authorised by governments. And also, to be blunt, we can't trust them to implement the kind of responses that are necessary. That has to be governments or indeed other bodies. So while I think they are responsible, in a way we can't ask them to discharge that responsibility by themselves. I'm not sure whether that answers your question.
All right. Start off with thinking about the international, within a domestic context, justice and how that competes with international. I think within the Australian context, you have the labour movement there asking for like $130,000 a year as part of the just transition, like pretty significant compensation packages for the workers there. And I think that's very hard to do politically, right? And so if we're asking for such significant compensation as forms of our just transition for a rich developed country, that does compete. I mean, there is a right to a decent job, but those rights are also in competition right now with the rights of least developed countries and the rights that are being lost, the rights to a decent livelihood, to life even, right? And I think that there's a tension there, and often those domestic justice concerns override or don't get properly weighed against that. So I think there are real tensions, and that the just transition language of a lot of domestic rich countries do not properly take that into concerns. And so this domestic justice amongst the privileged, relatively privileged, and it's not to say they aren't, workers that are in trouble, right, that deserve compensation, but there is a relative privileging there. In terms of the analogy of war rather than slaveholders, I agree. I mean, I'm part of the fossil fuel divestment movement. I am happy to declare war of a certain type on the fossil fuel industry. The aim of the slaveholder analogy was really more to just illuminate the inequities involved of that transfer of wealth, right? So if we were to transfer wealth to fossil fuel corporations, similarly to how we were compensating problematically slaveholders who were rich, who were wealthy, who didn't really have the moral right to own human beings, if we're compensating corporations, those are typically rich and who arguably don't have a right to burn fossil fuels that are incompatible with climate stability, then that's an equally problematic well, not equally, I don't want to necessarily say which is more problematic, but it's a problematic form of wealth transfer. And so that's the point of the slaveholder analogy, is not to say let's not declare war or like engage in a political struggle to contain the fossil fuel industry's power, but let's be cognizant of the problematic wealth and inequality that's there. And in terms of the transfer of production rights and then reinvesting, I think that's nice in theory. It would be great if the developed world was willing to give the additional money that they get from their lower cost production to the developing world. But you look at the Green Climate Fund, you look at the Least Developed Countries Fund, it's not really happening, which isn't to say that maybe it's not a mechanism for doing that, but I think in practice it's going to be very hard to achieve that sort of mechanism. And so there might have to be other ways that we think about how do we operationalize that.
I have thoughts on two questions, so thank you for that. The first one is on Andrea's question about like how do we hold our government accountable to sort of the negotiating position they have, and this is something I've thought about a lot, and I'm happy to share my really nerdy paper on this, but I honestly think it's about the boomerang effect, right? And so how do we use international foreign policy to sort of bring the debate back home? And I think that's easier said than done, but one way that people have done it is, this is not precisely related to fossil fuels, but to deforestation. And for climate litigation on deforestation in Colombia that we filed and won, I was one of the plaintiffs, we actually use a lot of the arguments that our negotiation was using at the UNFCCC. So sort of like really say, look, Colombia is being ambitious and wants an ambitious deal, and is talking about zero net deforestation by 2020, according to what it said in Cancun, and is not doing so. So I think that was a really useful way of trying to use sort of what was said and actually done in trying to effect some change. We can talk more about like whether litigation is the best way to do this. I have thoughts on that, but I think it is possible. I think it is just trying to connect sort of the specific and concrete things that have been mentioned with venues nationally to sort of affect that. And to the second question that I want to weigh in is the one about international and intranational equity, because it's something that I suggested as a topic of discussion. And in Colombia, I think this is huge. My fear with the equity discussion is that our governments use it as a way to just shield themselves from actually doing something. And again, I think it really depends what developing country we're talking about, because developing countries are so different and we're not monoliths. But when I'm thinking about Colombia, I'm thinking about a middle-income country that is sort of hiding sometimes behind this equity discussion to not do anything about our exports and about sort of the mining sector. So if we had a mining sector that actually was doing good mining and that actually sort of improve the quality of life of Colombians, I think we would be having a very different conversation. But when you look at the indicators, when you look at Andrea's research, it's obvious that it is not trickling down. The wealth is not trickling down. These are some of the most poor regions in Colombia with water scarcity. You have all sorts of human rights violations. So when that picture is clear to me, it seems that even if Colombia has a right to develop and export this coal, who is profiting from it? It's not the communities that live next to it. Maybe it's the people who mine in some way because they see an economic benefit, even though, again, long-term health affects what happens with that. But when you look at the country, it's not the people that are benefiting from it. And also, it's the same people who be most vulnerable, right? Like, ironically, the Guajira and Cesar are like very arid regions. Climate change will bring more droughts. And so, I don't know, I wonder. Sometimes I'm really a little bit skeptical about the equity discussion when it is used by developing countries to just hide from responsibility.
Thanks. I'm going to use Chair's prerogative to also weigh in on your question, Mark, along with Steve and Alex. I think that there's a strong case to be made for a real utility-based argument and least cost allocation of extraction. And there are some resources that are so high cost that there's no plausible argument for allowing them to be exploited. But Alex's point about just the practical consideration of making the transfers, the ex-post transfers then happen, given the history of the climate regime, really is an important point. And many countries that may feel that they have a moral claim to extract may think that it's highly risky or even foolish to cede that claim on the expectation of subsequent transfers. But there's another issue that arises, I think, and that's that the market would find us nominally, setting aside political economic factors, the lowest production cost resources, but that may not be factoring into account many of the other transitional costs associated with sunsetting an industry. And there may be some countries in which absorbing that labor force on a fairly rapid timescale into say a smallish economy that has few options at the moment, other than fossil fuel development, may be much, 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 much more difficult than absorbing a comparatively smaller labor force into a wealthier economy that has more alternatives and more capacity for developing further alternatives. So taking into account transition costs, there may be cost-related reasons for an allocation of the right to extract other than what market forces may find you. We've got about 5 minutes, And I think we could squeeze in 2 urgent and short questions and then pass it back to the
I suggest maybe one question.
One question.
Maybe two, because
Okay.
there's an immediate follow-up.
One very urgent and short question. I think that's the first hand I saw here. Yes.
This is a question I think I need help from both an economist and a philosopher on. And I really appreciate all the presentations. I'm intrigued and have often thought as a Canadian about your point, Jeremy, about the responsibility of exporter states. You know, we've gotten rich by selling our fossil fuels to someone else. But if I think about the way we might go about that, for instance, by applying a carbon tax at the point of production, as opposed to what a developing country that we export that fossil fuel to might do in applying the carbon tax, I'm curious, do we end up with the same outcome, but the money is going to the original wealthy state rather than to the destination state, which might actually be poorer?
I don't think the range of responses that a country like Canada or Australia should be confined to just taxing companies, I suppose. So there might be, I'm neutral about those responses. Mine tax sound like a good thing to me, but there'll also be other measures such as bans on exploration or indeed phase outs of production and so on, which may not involve those kinds of transfers. But I don't think there's anything in principle to say that the revenue raised from an exporting country via taxing its production facilities ought to stay in that country. Indeed, look, as I've said before, it's probably politically very unlikely that it would leave or not in large quantities. But morally speaking, I do think if you think some sort of harm principle, some sort of fault-based principle is important for allocating responsibility to fix global problems, then there'd be no reason why such funds couldn't flow outwards again if there was an appropriate mechanism. So at least in principle, imposing supply-side constraints wouldn't prevent a more cosmopolitan response like that.
Thanks, Jeremy. According to my watch, our panel has the right to extract 1 more minute from the agenda, which we'll happily cede. In recognizing Ambassador Tudela's comments at the end of morning session, I think that we can all thank the panel for making us both more well-informed and more confused, which Ambassador says is positive progress. So thank you very much.